Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hello from the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG, and welcome to tonight's Weekday Night Bite event. Did you hear that? Horror and the Sonic. And we've got a fantastic panel to talk about all things horror, soundtrack, score, sound, music. And we're delighted to have chairing for us this evening, James Rendell. So I'm going to introduce James, and then he's going to introduce our panelists, who we're also very pleased to have with us, and we're really looking forward to this chat. So Dr. James Rendell is a lecturer in creative industries at the University of South Wales. He's published in various journals and edited collections, and is the author of Transmedia Terrors in Post-TV Horror. His research has frequently focused on sound in popular culture, including musical performances live streamed during the pandemic, audiences responding to film screenings accompanied by live orchestras, and horror fans designing their own soundtrack vinyl mock-ups. He's most recently published work in feminist media studies on choral screaming serving as female empowerment in the horror TV series Yellow Jackets. So welcome, James.
Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. So if they want to turn their cameras and their mics on. There we go, but yeah. So the super group tonight that we've formed, we have Dr. Janet K. Steve Halfyard, who is the head of the Bachelor's of Music programme at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow. Their research is mainly focused on music in horror and supernatural and superhero film and TV, and publications include Danny Elfman's Batman, a film score guide, Sounds of Fear and Wonder, Music and Cult TV, and two edited collections, Music, Sound and Silence in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Music and Fantasy Cinema. They have recently co-edited the Palgrave Handbook of Music and Sound in Peak TV with Nicholas Rayland, which should be in print later in 2024. Then we have Dr. Thomas Joseph Watson, who's a senior lecturer in transmedia production at Teesside University, where he also acts as a co-course leader for film and television production, BA. His research focused on the manifestations of violence in contemporary audiovisual culture, with a distinct focus on formal aesthetics. His recent work considers the nature of transgression in cult cinema, gothic tropes in so-called hardcore horror cinema, and representations of punk subcultures and extreme politics on screen. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Leanne Weston, obtained her PhD in film and television studies from the University of Warwick. She's currently an independent scholar, and her work typically explores the interactions between music, sound, and screen media. She's published work in The Velvet Light Trap, Viewfinder, Critical Studies in Television, and The Conversation. Leanne has also contributed to several edited collections on a range of subjects, including Watership Down, Jane Campion, and Julie Taymor. So the purpose of this talk, I guess, is to bring music to the fore. And since you're all scholars that are interested in and research horror, sound, and music, I wondered if you could explain how you approach your analysis and methods, because you all seem to come from it from very different ways. So I'll start with you, Steve.
Oh, right. Okay, so I'm probably the most conventional musicologist in the room, I suspect. And my approach has always been very much about reading the music to understand, therefore, how it's constructing and interpreting the narrative for us. So a lot of that is just kind of digging down into the cultural codes that the music's presenting us, things that we understand music meaning, the semiotics of music, even though we don't necessarily consciously understand that, you know, this nasty chord says something evil is coming, or this lovely melody says this is a pretty woman and we should all fall in love with her. So there are all these cultural codes embedded within music that composers instinctively know in the same way the rest of us know. So my approach is about unpicking, therefore, how music is interpreting narrative for us. And my method involves endlessly watching and transcribing the music, which is unbelievably time consuming. In 25 years of writing about film and television music, I have only ever once had access to a written score, and everything else has been done by oral transcription. So yeah, believe me, that takes a 40-minute episode of a TV show will take me about 2 hours to watch.
Wow,
So yeah.
Yeah,
fun.
I'm happy with the audience-based stuff. Seems much quicker.
I've seen Batman about 200 times.
Fab. Tom?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this earlier, and I think my sort of approach to research around horror and music in particular, I guess, well, like all of us, maybe it's a little bit self-indulgent at first because I'm a massive fan of horror, but I'm also a massive fan of some of the bands and musicians who are kind of involved in the genre, but also kind of approach to write music or have their music appropriated within various films. And it was a while ago. I used to teach at Manchester Met, and that got me really sort of heavily invested in subcultural studies. And that was kind of a catalyst to link those two things together. So my analysis of genre in terms of horror and extreme violence, but also, you know, what does that say, or how does that kind of interact with subcultures, not necessarily just of horror, but of, you know, like punk, hardcore, black metal, gothic, and all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of my approach to that. My methods, I guess, is that kind of really well, again, watching a lot of textual analysis, but also really interested in kind of certain filmmakers where they're coming from subculturally as well. So punk filmmakers who are interested in various bands or have been in various bands and how they're incorporating their cinema. So it's kind of a mixture of kind of textual analysis versus cultural studies, I guess. To wrap it up, and I know I'm rambling a bit, so that's my response. Yeah.
And Leanne?
Hello. Yes. I've also been thinking this through across the week as well, and I think this will be no surprise, I guess, for those that out there that know me. But it's usually the thing that catches my ear rather than catches my eye. So I've done a bit of work on trailers and the use of kind of golden oldies and horror trailers in particular, and I really like the way that kind of snags your attention. And then I follow that, as Stephen Thomas said, with a really close kind of textual reading, watching it again and again and thinking about it from a different vantage, from the perspective of memory studies and nostalgia studies, and what it means to engage nostalgically with something that's being used in a really different context. And the different context is what I find most exciting, I think, when things appear in kind of incongruous places, like Sonic Youth in the trailer for High Tension, for example, or The Hills Have Eyes, the Orts remakes, and All the Boys Love Mandy Lane had a very kind of high-profile oldies example, and I'm really drawn to those kind of incongruities and how they work and what that means.
Fab. I'm also, I mean, I read your Watership Down chapter today as well, and I loved the idea of using subtitles as a form of analysis. So it's open access, so everyone should go and read it. It's very, very good.
Yeah. Thank you. Do read it.
So sort of building on from that then, and sort of thinking about today, historical understandings of horror as a kind of body genre tend to bring to the fore the visual, whether that be the kind of restrained imagery of the Gothic, the stresses psychological horror, corporeal horrality that's developed in horror film, or the rise of hard-edged cinematic television horror, and the advancement of photorealism in horror video games. And I wonder, this seems to bring technological and industrial context together where soundscapes could be located within such discussions. And I mean, I know, Tom, you were talking there about sort of violence and perhaps where subcultures and scenes and movements. So I'll go to you first with that, if you've got a.
I mean, I think for me, like reading the question, kind of thinking about it, you're kind of touching upon, I suppose, I don't know if it's various cycles or forms of kind of horror as it's expressed within those different forms of media, and how kind of maybe we're seeing different cycles of soundtracks and kind of music which fits into that. And I'm not sure that's necessarily answering that question in any straightforward way, because that was kind of what I initially thought. But now that I'm thinking about my kind of own research, especially I suppose around sort of subcultures and how that kind of fits into the mix, some of my recent research has been into kind of slasher cinema, and especially the movie Straight Edge Kayako, which is obviously this kind of straight edge hardcore punk slasher where you've got the killers of these militant straight edge aficionados. And in terms of the industrial context around that, it's really interesting kind of talking to the filmmakers, because they're kind of saying it's not necessarily for that audience, although you have to have that kind of level of subcultural capital to kind of understand what that means. Because I'd imagine, you know, in the audience this evening, if I'm talking about hardcore and straight edge, not everyone's necessarily going to know what that means in terms of, you know, an abstinence from alcohol, smoking, drugs, and promiscuous sex and all that kind of stuff. So if you're a militant straight edge or straight edge person who identifies in that way within a horror film, and you're killing, you know, the teens that are engaged in that promiscuous behavior, it's sort of reminiscent of what slasher films are doing historically anyway. It just kind of repurposes them and recontextualizes them. So I think industrially it's quite interesting how it's approaching those types of audiences. If that makes sense. Again, I'm kind of pontificating a little bit there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And to you, Steve?
Yeah, one of the particular ways that technological changes and convergences have kind of changed horror soundscapes is the way that the technologies surrounding sound design and the technologies surrounding musical composition have really come together. And in horror in particular, one of the results of that has been the way that increasingly there's very little difference between things which stand as sound design and things which stand as music. I mean, one outstanding example of that is the television series of Hannibal, where Brian Reitzel functioned both as sound designer and as composer. And so those really did at that point converge. And part of that is to do with the way that good old Christian Metz separates out music and what he called real noises. So the diegetic sound and the music, which can be diegetic or non-diegetic, but nonetheless, you've got music which can move between positions within diegesis, and the sound which is supposed to emit from the diegesis itself. You bring those two things together and they have a particular potential to operate across the kind of spectrum of the uncanny, where you have a sound which you don't know whether it's music or sound, you don't know whether it's inside or outside of the diegesis. And it's created quite different soundscapes particularly in the 21st century compared to the more orchestral scores that we hear absolutely in the early 20th century, but also carrying on through the mid and late 20th century. You're still orchestrally dominant in a huge number of schools. You're either using orchestra or you're using popular music, and sometimes a combination of the two. And the new thing in the 20th century is this convergence of sound design and music that is particularly prevalent in horror because of the way that it allows us to access the uncanny.
That's fascinating. I mean, I wonder to that point as well, if we're thinking about the kind of convergence and change, and to Tom's point about perhaps sort of sometimes horror being a kind of a cheaper genre in many ways, or, you know, a genre that people cut their teeth on, where AI may come in sound design. I know, yeah, because what does that mean for classical music and for pop when you have something that is, you know, completely digitized? I mean, maybe that's something that's, I mean, it's debated already, isn't it, that whether you know, creators should be using it, and whether we see that with music and sound as well. Put all of us out of a job.
I'm not sure. Well, let's just say I hope not, because actually it's that human understanding of what registers as uncanny, what registers as abject, what simply registers as creepy, that I'm not sure AI is yet able to access, and we might end up with some hideous sonic equivalents to people with 3 legs and 6 fingers on each hand, which I suppose would be definitely creepy, but just not necessarily signifying in the right way. I really hope that it's a very long time before AI is able to engage with the kind of subtleties that we hear in musical scoring and sound design. So, I mean,
and fans will be very unhappy as well, I think. I mean, my own interest in horror audiences and fans, and I was thinking, horror often aligns itself with cult sensibilities and some subcultures, but also, it's a genre that's hugely popular. It's popcorn, it makes a lot of money. And I just wondered, how can the role of music in horror support these subcultural distinctions, or in fact problematize them? So Leanne, I'll go to you for that.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, in when we came together to discuss this. And I think there's a really interesting tension between what you've highlighted about kind of really specific subcultures of you, as you've mentioned, Tom, but then also really kind of populist stuff. And I've mentioned John Carpenter already in our little previews, but I think he's a good example of this, and that he's very kind of beloved and popular, but he also comes from a genre that might be considered kind of more, not in this context, but more kind of niche for people that don't like it. So I think it has an alignment with cult, obviously, from coming from horror, but also it's kind of popular enough to be a musical signature, the kind of hence 5/4 rhythm of a piano melody. And in that sense, I'll get to the point in a second, James, I promise. In that sense, I think it's a really useful kind of cultural intermediary to kind of jump gaps between subcultures and maybe kind of not enmesh the tribal nature of it, because I think it always remains that way, but kind of blend them harmonically, perhaps. And I didn't mean to make that.
And to Tom?
I think when I was thinking about this, like, I mean, my interests are maybe in the more niche kind of examples of cult horror cinema, and sort of, that kind of speaks to various levels of subcultural capital anyway. And there is a sense of kind of gatekeeping which goes on within that. And obviously a sense of, I get these references more than you, or I recognize that band t-shirt more than you in that particular example, that horror movie or whatever. But I suppose when I was thinking about this, to kind of, I suppose, reposition that in more mainstream context, is that sometimes we get sort of really sort of popular films, which obviously, they're not necessarily making loads of money, but like, they're not like niche sort of like unrated horrors that, I might look at otherwise. But then their soundtracks, they have that kind of cult audience beyond that. So you might have whatever film which has, 500 versions of one particular pressed colour vinyl, and then you might have, I don't know, 10 copies of one, which I must own all of them, of course, because it feeds into that kind of collector culture as well. And I think when we move into some of those areas, in my own research especially, there is a certain level of toxicity within that. And I think that kind of problematizes those subcultural distinctions, because again, you do kind of get those people who are very protective or gatekeeping over those kind of sounds, or that particular, it becomes another object, so a blood red splatter of like a Lucio Fulci movie from the 70s, which is like a limited 10 edition copy from, I don't know, whatever record label. There's like people who are invested in those kind of cultural objects, which maybe removes it from the film slightly as well. And I don't know, that harmonious blending, I guess, in my experience, there's sort of like a jarring with that. And that might be because of like quite, like toxic fandom, which might be more male orientated as well. That kind of comes up time and time again, especially when I'm on collector forums and looking at those kinds of things, So yeah, I think that's quite an interesting area that I've came across, not in any depth, but just kind of cursory, looking at where soundtracks can be bought and sold, and what the attitudes around certain examples are,
Yeah, it's like a marrying of sort of gendering of horror and cult, and then kind of pop music as being kind of feminine, but also kind of mainstream horror that's using those kind of sound. But TV is kind of different, I guess. I mean, Steve, I'm thinking of your book where, quality and cult is often hugely popular rather than the kind of the niche and the underground.
Yeah, and I was thinking, as Tom was talking in particular, about the way that popular music is used, particularly in shows like Buffy and Supernatural. And so with Buffy, you have, I mean, Buffy is one of the shows at the end of the 20th century which was really important in the development of online cult TV fandom, with the website The Bronze, and all of the offshoots from that, and the various fans who were compiling these lists of all the popular music being used. And that was quite interesting because there the popular music was not identified with a particular character, it was identified with a space. And so it was inclusive really of all of the young characters who used that space, the Bronze nightclub. Supernatural took it a different way and had it as, in some ways, a much more as a symbol almost of the intense but problematic relationship between father and son, between Dean and John. But again, it came with all these connotations that you get with hard rock and heavy metal, and the occult. So it kind of problematized the character as a particular type of masculinity at some levels. But yeah, so television. Oh, and please don't get me started on the Vampire Diaries. The twilight of TV. But again, intense use of popular music as a way of presenting characters to particularly a younger audience. I think with that one, I know it's as with Buffy, a huge age range in the audience, but a way of allowing fans to access and identify with characters and understand the subtext of narratives in the way that the song lyrics spoke to things. So almost in effect creating a cult sensibility through the use of popular music, rather than having a pre-existing one that came into it. The TV show itself becomes the cult object, and the fandom and the music related fandom then extends from that. I'm going to shut up now.
And we kind of get the opposite, or sort of the inverse of that as well, where we're seeing horror iconography and sort of generics spill out from film, TV, video games into musical scenes. I mean, the Gothic is, I guess, the obvious one, but sort of death and black metal. Lady Gaga fans are Little Monsters. There's the hip hop group Clipping that are very kind of John Carpenter, and obviously like the punk bands like the Misfits and AFI and stuff like that. So it's interesting how there's this kind of pendulum of where horror is being used, sort of, and bringing in subcultures or creating subcultures in some ways. I mean, that again, it kind of speaks to kind of your work, Tom, I think.
It's when things like from the famous Monsters album that they had, again, probably early 2000s. And this again, it's kind of how I'm getting into all of these different scenes. So I'm a big fan of Romero in the zombie films. And then I hear Misfits, Scream, which was obviously Michael Graves' era rather than Glenn Danzig era. So they kind of moved on from that. So the video, which I still really rate, it's just the simple kind of horror film zombie invasion narrative, which I show to my students all of the time, because it's just like really sort of like rough and ready, lo-fi, so cool. But you've got like I suppose one of the other examples, which kind of straddles, I don't know, it's kind of like from music to celebrity back to music and then film, would be Henry Rollins from Black Flag.
Yeah.
So he's in one of my favorite films. I suppose more contemporary horror films. He Never Dies, where he plays, I think it's Cain, obviously from Cain and Abel, the kind of the Bible story, and he's this kind of undead, I don't know, like venging angel or something like that. But again, my sort of like, I've sort of a bit of hero worship for him, but haven't been familiar with his work, Black Flag, Band, and his spoken word stuff. But kind of, it's that pendulum's swinging, but it's really meshing. It's just like a perfect film that I felt was like made for me almost, which I think is really interesting. I guess putting my own kind of subjectivity within that. I'm not really sure what you would call fans of Henry Rollins. It's not like Little Monsters, the Lady Gaga fans. I don't know. I'll maybe coin something later on about that, I think. But the other example that I always tend to use is the Detroit hardcore bands Negative Approach, because a lot of their artwork is, it's calling back to kind of classic horror cinema. So they use images from The Exorcist quite a lot in their logos and their kind of imagery. There's punk bands that I'm really into that embrace kind of horror imagery. They're named after antagonists like Voorhees, Leatherface from the Northeast, just kind of on my doorstep. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting how that pendulum does swing. But again, I think it's a lot of these creatives are obviously interested in the genre, and then they've incorporated that in their work, and then that kind of feeds back into the genre. It's kind of like a not a reciprocal relationship, but it's almost like a tidal sort of momentum, I guess, is the way that I think about it. It's like, well, we're doing this, feeds into that, that's now feeding back into this. And that, what's that band that I know Shelley's in the audience, she'll not be happy that I haven't remembered. I want to say, is it it's Ice Nine Kills, I think, that have, concept albums based on horror cinema. They come on stage dressed like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho and have these really elaborate sort of set pieces, which not necessarily my type of music, maybe, but I think the spectacle of that would be really excellent. So yeah, I am going to shut up now because this is kind of interesting. Yeah. So I think it is interesting how that to use James' analogy there, the pendulum swinging. It's almost in a continuous momentum, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of flip that, I guess that the way that then the casting of musicians, someone like Rollins, for example, who are sort of subculturally aligned or can interpolate pre-existing fans. So I'm thinking of like David Bowie in The Hunger, Debbie Harry in Videodrome, Kelly Rowland in Freddy vs. Jason, and we mentioned sort of Lady Gaga in American Horror Story, and Ice-T in Leprechaun in the Hood, that classic. So yeah, we'll go Leanne.
Yeah, I think to kind of build on what Tom's saying about kind of your very nice analogy too, James, about the pendulum swing. I do think that has the benefit of maybe drawing people into horror that might not usually engage with it. So the Kelly Rowland example I'm thinking of, and Lady Gaga as well, to a lesser degree. And obviously that increases box office take, of course, and you get a different layer of engagement, I think. And maybe, as many of us here can attest, it might be a kind of gateway drug experience, for want of a better phrase. But I also think that kind of level of casting is also reflective or a signal of the popularity and the kind of mainstream adjacent nature of some popular horror franchises. And maybe we can also connect that into discussions of horror's economic value and kind of cultural capital in that sense as well.
Steve, do you want to add something? Yeah.
There's also an additional thing about musicians and horror and the idea of what a musician is, because both the real musicians finding themselves in horror narratives, but also the presence of musicians within horror narratives. There is something about musicians that is automatically other at some level. And so David Bowie is playing a musician in The Hunger. And the film is and also directly horror and kind of horror adjacent film is full of problematic characters who are musicians, and being a musician is part of how they are constructed as problematic, whether it's The Crow or Jack Nicholson in The Witches of Eastwick, or the talented Mr. Ripley, or whatever the girl's name is in Swim Fan. She's a cellist and a serial killer. There we go. That's what we like. Hannibal, obviously, Hannibal, automatically, you've got the musician as problematic character. Lestat in The Vampire Lestat, more than an interview. In Interview with the Vampire, he's a classical musician. In the Vampire Lestat, he reinvents himself as a popular musician. So there is something that is culturally perceived as other about being a musician, about that level of technical expertise and inexplicable talent that I think lends itself to the presence of musicians within horror narratives. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, you got me thinking of Only Lovers Left Alive now.
Oh, crying out loud. Yes, absolutely. That's wonderful. That's such a good example. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I love that film, is the idea that a vampire is the most extraordinary musician the world has ever produced.
I mean, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Sometimes this interpolation, or it can bring fans, but then sometimes when you see the musician, it kind of almost breaks the immersion, because you're like, oh, it's like almost like a cameo or whoever it is. It can work in some ways that it kind of creates the kind of background or aligns itself, but then also it can be kind of rupturing as well, almost like an Easter egg.
A kind of duplicate image of the real musician and the character they play, who
Yeah.
at some level is possibly also Lady Gaga, even though there's such a heavy reference to the hunger in Lady Gaga's presence in American Horror Story. I'm slightly disappointed that there's no string trio playing in American Horror Story Hotel. I miss that. I keep on wanting her to sit down at the piano or get out her violin.
So alongside this, then, I guess the kind of popularity of musicians, we're in the midst of a kind of trend of horror that's sort of overtly nostalgic. So series like Stranger Things and Yellow Jackets, music is both culturally and sort of individually autobiographical, seems central to this. And do you think this kind of wave then differs from other cycles of horror? I mean, Leanne, you've presented on Yellow Jackets, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of, as a cultural moment that you've identified, James, I think we should also, acknowledge the increased kind of both the scholarly and popular significance of music, the role of music supervision as a thing, because I think it's become a lot more prominent particularly in discussions of popular culture and through the legitimacy of it through the Guild of Music Supervision. So I think that's part of why that it's become more prominent. I also think it's become more, there's been more attention to, as this talk is proof of, there's more attention to soundtrack as a kind of textual element, as something to focus upon and think about and look at. So I think in that sense, this use of these soundtracks, and as Steve said about Buffy, it can be used as a kind of pathway for engagement, and particularly for re-engagement with non-contemporary music, and as in Yellow Jackets, and of course Stranger Things, with lots of people buying Kate Bush records that might not have. So there's recognition on a cultural level for the people that do this work, but also recognition musically for music that we might not have engaged with typically.
Yeah. And to you, Tom?
So yeah, I was thinking about this recently because I was doing a rewatch of Stranger Things prior to season 5 dropping imminent, and it was particularly around the use of Metallica with the Eddie Munson character in the later series, and that got me kind of thinking. This is partly around discussions of hair metal bands on sort of slasher or more kind of franchise horror soundtracks in the 1980s. So I'm thinking of bands like Dokken, people like Alice Cooper, and my favourite band, which aren't hair metal but feature in one of the Nightmare on Elm Street series entries, Dramarama in part, the Dream Master, I believe it was. And those are kind of like, I don't know, that's evocative of a different kind of nostalgia for me, because it's like, see a series like Yellow Jackets, which had, Smashing Pumpkins, Portishead, all of those kinds of, and it's kind of, it's taking us back to that particular era. Whereas when I'm watching sort of, I don't know, the franchise horrors from the 80s, obviously I wasn't around during that time. I kind of, I was born in 1987, so I didn't get to experience any of that the first time around. So I'm kind of living my fandom, or this kind of, I don't know, this weird sense of non-nostalgia through those soundtracks. And I think there's a few, my good friends who are also horror academics, born probably around the same time, they kind of experience that as well. And those are the discussions that we have. And I also think it's interesting that, you've got people who are, you know, they're born and they're kind of, that's their kind of pop culture, which is then feeding into the work that they're writing or what they're directing, what they're soundtracking, soundscaping, all of that. Those influences are all kind of feeding into that. But I think it's interesting when you're asking how is it different from other cycles of horror. And I just think it's that idea of intertextuality, which kind of feeds in everything now, and maybe ways that are, I think, even more and more prominent now. So there's like metatextuality, postmodernism, all of this kind of stuff. Like, you can't not be conscious nostalgia, because, you know, I was watching the first couple of series of Stranger Things, again, born in 1987. I have no knowledge of small town America, really, other than what I've seen through kind of John Carpenter movies and things like that. So those soundtracks evoke those memories that aren't even mine, you know, which I think is a really interesting kind of dynamic to understand. Sorry about the technical issue there. I think my signal's a bit rubbish. Sorry.
I mean, really briefly, I'll try to be really brief. I mean, I think I'm picking up that postmodern idea. I think we are have been for a long time in a cycle of nostalgia with our film and television in general, never mind just horror. And one of the things, I have to say this as a apart from, thanks Tom for making me feel really old, I graduated in the 1980s.
Sorry.
One of the funniest things about Stranger Things is that the soundtrack music is much more 70s, and it's actually quite funny hearing this kind of, okay, so our nostalgia button tells us, ooh, this is that period back then, but it's actually not accurate. So the popular music grounds it more into the 80s. I bought Hounds of Love when it first came out. I had it on LP, but nonetheless, it's the surrounding music actually is tapping more into our idea of what this period may have sounded like, rather than what it actually did sound like, which is what we get through the popular music. Anyway, that was just an aside.
But I think it's pertinent to sort of for the last couple of questions then to kind of flip this on its head, because, you know, we're thinking about the pertinence of sound and, you know, the diegetic and the non-diegetic in horror. But what about the absence of sound in horror? So I'm thinking of deaf mute character Maddie in Hush, or the Blair Witch Project, where there is no soundtrack. Steve, do you want to?
Oh yeah, go on. My main way into this has been through found footage, because one of the things that, as a musicologist, fascinated me about found footage is the absence of score, and how therefore does a horror film with no score actually do all the work that music, we assume, does. And so yeah, that was a really interesting process of discovery. And one of the things that I came to a conclusion of is to do with channels of communication, and the gaps left in the soundtrack. So you take out all the dialogue, and you take out all the music, and what you're left with is the sound. And if you then dial that down, so rather than having the figure or the ground, all you're left with is the field, the absolute background sound that you never listen to, you leave your audience in a position of having to listen really intently to the types of sounds they would normally ignore, constantly anticipating that something's going to happen. So you're effectively in silence, or very, very slightly modified silence. And one of the joys of found footage is that quite often nothing does happen. And you're just left with endless space of nothing happening, but you're working so hard to notice that it can actually be a really intense and quite uncomfortable experience. So yeah, found footage takes a totally a related approach, but translated through a medium that says, okay, well, you can't have any music unless you cheat. There are lots of found footage films that cheat. by introducing it diegetically. So As Above, So Below has got one of the most fantastically lovely soundtracks. It's utterly weird, but they do it all diegetically. So when they're in the catacombs of Paris, they discover a choir singing and a piano that keeps accidentally playing a single note of itself, and all kinds of things like that. So they bring the music back in as a specifically uncanny gesture. So yeah, it's about playing with the diegetic, because you can't have any non-diegetic sound now. Everything's got to be diegetic, but when it exists in places where it shouldn't be, therefore that's our route into horror.
I guess sort of building on that then, as a kind of as sort of related to that last question, I wonder what the panel's thoughts were on perhaps the difficulties of translating horror soundscapes for those that can't hear them. So where we might be able to triangulate horror studies and music studies, but also disability studies. Marcella Wiffler-Stefani and Anna Matamala's recent study of audio descriptions for deaf and hard of hearing audiences and their responses to horror cinema, because as we've said, this is such a thing that's been celebrated in subcultures. It's textually effective, and yet what does it mean when we have to translate, I mean, and sort of re-articulate the audio into something that isn't audio? So I mean, this speaks to some of the work that you've done, Leanne.
Yeah. So what James is referring to is a piece I wrote about Watership Down, and its kind of cultural conferred reading as horror. And I used part of that, the analysis for that was using the subtitle track off the DVD to see where the cues were and what the descriptive cues were. But to, when it said angry, scared, frightened, and those words were used. So it was cueing you to interpret the action in certain ways. But I also think, James, you've raised a really important point about the effectiveness and the accuracy of those transcription modes. And I'm not going to say that, I've thought of this myself. It was cued by an article that I read recently by Charlotte Little of Matchbox Cine, and she's written about the kind of experiential difficulties of being in a cinema when either the subtitle tracks are lacking descriptors or they're incorrect, and it's fundamentally changing the experience for her and the meaning of the images she's receiving, but also the experiencing in comparison to hearing peers, which I think is a really intriguing but also saddening avenue to think about looking at. I just wondered what the rest of the panel's thoughts were on that, if you've been to caption screenings, and what you've thought about that as well. Sorry to hijack it a little bit, James, it just popped into my mind.
No, it's a good point. But it's even, if you have on the background, you're watching a Netflix series and it says dramatic music for every bit of sound, and it's like, well, it sort of says everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah, there are real problems in the captioning industry with, and Netflix is a case in point, that the speed at which captioners are expected to work and the rates of pay means that there's so many rules for them. The handbook for captioners is hundreds of pages long, and so they're not musicians by and large. That's not their specialism, and so they end up having to use their own generalist, non-specialist, subjective response to what they're hearing to bring in ideas about what the music is. And yeah, I've been there where it says dramatic music, and you're thinking, no, this is ominous. This isn't dramatic. This is ominous. This is slow and spooky. But yeah, so music just becomes almost a casualty of the pressures put on captioners. And there's some really interesting work going on with other people not working in the caption industry about how one might caption music. how one might bring different ideas of music into how one is captioned using visual imagery on the screen, particularly for the D-Deaf community, to give them an impression and an experience of music in a visual form. So yeah, there have been some interesting propositions, but nothing really taken up yet for television. And Leanne probably knows much more about this than I do.
No, I think what you've shed light on there, Steve, is really important. That most of the time the people who are captioning aren't musicians, and I think that, you know, it's like most forms of translation, makes me think of language translation as well. It's an interpretive practice, so you're going to hear it differently to me. For example, I'm not a musicologist. I just like music a lot. But of course, our interpretations of the same piece of music will be wildly different. So it depends who's authoring the captions as well, isn't it? As you've highlighted so nicely.
Yeah, what kind of vocabulary they have at their disposal in how they think about music. If they've never actually had to do this in the rest of their life, and suddenly they're then asking to, okay, describe this music. That's a hard thing to do if you've never done it before.
No, it's difficult as well. But that I've put Charlotte's article in the chat for anybody who wants to read it, and it was really eye-opening to me, because they use the example of not non-horror examples of challenges and zone of interest, and how their experience of those two films were very different to their hearing partner. And I think it's a really interesting perspective to get more detail on, I think, is the best way to describe it. See, it's hard to describe these.
It is. That's it. I mean, to your point, Leanne, as sort of wrap up. So if people want to start writing questions in the box, and we'll carry on then and open up to the audience. So in thinking about horror fandoms, and we've said, we're all fans of music and different horror music and artists and everything. Soundtracks do seem to be an important aspects of text that allow fans to curate and collect. And I'm thinking of whether that be digital playlist or analog vinyl or remixing, taking things and adding music, changing music. What does this tell us about the pleasures of horror as a kind of genre? So we'll go with Tom.
Yeah, I mean, as a person who's an avid collector of vinyl, and has also sort of developed a penchant for cassette tapes in recent years. So I'm really sort of someone who's hunting down a lot of kind of soundtracks on cassette, whether it's originals or kind of re-released versions from like boutique labels and things like that. So that's kind of satisfying maybe another part of my fandom as an avid collector, which kind of straddles both horror in terms of trying to get all of the Arrow releases of whatever Fulci film comes out, or I don't know, whatever Severin movie that's coming out, as well as what Mondo used to put out when they were releasing sort of early sort of horror soundtracks on vinyl and things like that. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's different kinds of fandom that are articulated there. I think obviously again that pendulum swinging back and forth, but in my recent research, or fairly recent research into dark synth, and some of the artists that were involved in various projects which kind of hang within that umbrella term, it was really interesting to see how artists who were presumably fans and would articulate their fandom via reimaginings of soundtracks, particularly for slasher films. So there was an American artist particularly who I was interested in, called Gregorio Franco, who made soundtracks for his own slasher series. So you had Stalker Part 1, 2, and I think he's working on the third one at the moment. And these are films which obviously never existed, but there's a backstory to them. There's a kind of a treatment, a synopsis. There's these really sort of intricate soundtracks which have been developed by this guy whose practice is his fandom, and is using his abilities as a musician to produce these really interesting records, which again, there might be a limited 10 versions of a Buzzsaw vinyl splattered with blood, which I'm still on the lookout for. So if anyone's got any leads, by all means, share that with me. So So it is. The other thing that's interesting as well, there's a lot of soundtracks made and kind of, for films that didn't exist in the first place, which I think is really interesting, as well as kind of reimagined soundtracks. So it's kind of like, people have close relationships with particular films that they want to then rescore or have another soundtrack, or they want to kind of make their own project via sound, which I think is really interesting. So it's almost like you hear the soundtrack, you can see what the title of the song is, you can almost see what's on screen. So it's almost like that would be your, I don't know, your mood book or your shot list almost to hear the images. So I think that's a really interesting practice, which I've come across in my own research, So yeah.
Yeah, and I know they've done that for things like Twin Peaks and Stranger Things, haven't
Yeah,
they? They've released albums that do not attach to actual episodes, but still fit within the kind of soundscape of those series. Yeah. Leanne?
Yeah, I was just thinking, kind of build on what you were saying, Tom. I think there's a really interesting tension between having streaming and the digital and the kind of things to curate at your own fingertips, and then that the kind of more classic physical media thing of kind of having it, possessing it, collecting it. And I think those two things are in tension, but they also work as part of the pleasures of fandom, I think, because as you pointed out, Tom, there's a huge resurgence in collecting of vinyl and cassette tapes. I'm also one of those people. I don't even have anything to play it on, and I collect them. Cassette tapes, that is. I do have things to play vinyl. So I think, the kind of pleasure in having your own little library is important as well, as you've illustrated so nicely, Tom.
And Steve?
This is a bit out of my area. I don't collect anything and I know nothing about collecting. Although I do have a complete copy of the Batman score under my bed.
I mean, that's cool as well. But I mean, that's an interesting other thing. I mean, even things like books that are the scores of film scores and stuff. That's another way that fans could engage in a fan practice of reading the music and playing.
So rare. There's been a recent I mean, what you have are the piano scores that get issued, which are essentially very, very low level pianistic ability, but actually getting hold of the actual scores, it took a year and cost $1,500, and that was in 2001. So it's getting hold there's a really small collection of film scores that have been issued quite recently in kind of bespoke editions, and they are collector's items and they're jolly expensive. But yeah, the only film score, the only project I've ever worked on where I had access to the score was Batman, and I still had to watch it 200 times.
That's because you're a real fan.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Less so now.
Well, we've got some questions in the chat. So Laura's asked if I can read it. So she said that the talks made her think about record labels that are known for horror soundtrack releases. So Death Waltz and Waxwork Records, and how we might see them as having a particular kind of brand identity and particular kind of cult appeal. This is kind of open to everyone, but yeah, it's interesting how we've also got the DVD labels and the kind of various production companies that are sort of really championed by fans, but actually those labels now are becoming equally, or they frame them in a different way with their kind of cult sensibilities and what they add, I think. But yeah, what do others think?
Yeah, I think, James, you've highlighted really nicely that there's a whole kind of cultural paratextual industry connected with soundtracks and, of course, physical DVD and Blu-ray releases. And I think that's also kind of endemic of internet culture and everything feeling quite transitory, not tangible anymore. So things can just disappear. So your own collection, if you don't have it as a physical collection, can disappear into the ether of the internet. And I think that's why the boutique labels for records and for disc releases have become so influential and so culturally important for engagement for fans as well. I think that's a bit of a ramble. Hopefully it gets somewhere, Laura.
Yeah, and you know, much like a DVD or a Blu-ray special edition, you know, quite
Yeah.
often the extra textual features of the vinyl that you might get, you know, notes written by composers who are not going to be given that kind of space or that kind of authorial voice on or less likely on a DVD or some other place.
No, that's very true. I'm thinking about ones that I own that have kind of those notes like that. So that's really important space for their voices to be heard as part of the creative process as well, I think.
Tom?
I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, I think Laura's mentioned the Death Waltz label specifically there. And, you know, I was an avid collector of everything that they put out, which didn't necessarily do my wallet any favors. And I think that's also something which is really interesting, following on from the last question, is this idea of, you know, accessibility to these kind of soundtracks when they are released, because it's obviously it's not cheap to buy a limited edition piece of vinyl. And it, you know, it might be like a jewel for like two sort of whatever it is. So you're probably looking at the best part of 40 to 50 quid, I guess. So definitely living beyond my means with the collection that I've currently amassed. But one of the other interesting things with that is that a lot of these labels were kind of speaking to fans and kind of subcultural sensibilities by getting people like, I don't know, Graham Humphreys to do new limited edition artwork. So I think one of the original Death Waltz records that I got, which was a very early release from the company, was for their release of Zombie Flesh Eaters. And I think I've mentioned Lucio Fulci quite a few times tonight, but obviously the Fabio Frizzi scores from those films is obviously what's on the vinyl. But you've got kind of links to the Video Nasties era in the UK through an association with Graham Humphreys, who obviously did the poster for The Evil Dead. So again, there's kind of another level of subcultural cachet that is built around those products, or that kind of ephemera, I guess. And then that tied in with some of the early Arrow releases that they were putting out as well. So again, I think it's really interesting because it's another level of engagement again. But I do really think it's interesting that you mentioned that, you know, composers might be given space to talk about the film in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to extra or whatever release that is. Certainly maybe not through a streaming platform. It's all those kind of that ephemeral detail which is really interesting. And it reminds me, I think when I completed my PhD in 2015, one of my very good friends bought me it was the very plush release of the Cannibal Holocaust soundtrack. Really beautiful music. But obviously that's accompanied by the really harsh imagery which is in the inlay. But then that's like I've got like whatever blood splatters, freshly commissioned artwork that was there at the time because it was like a limited edition out of 100. Do you know what I mean? So it's that collectability, that desire that I've got to have these items, which is ridiculous and says a lot about me than I probably care to admit, to be quite honest. But there we go. So it is. It's a lot. That question speaks to my relationship with a lot of that material, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, and I had a Death Waltz T-shirt, which unfortunately, because I started going to the gym in the last 10 years, I'm not bragging at all, but I used to be able to fit into a small T-shirt, whereas now it's very much extra large. So my stepdad, who has no clue what Death Waltz means, is still wearing that T-shirt as a kind of a hand me up almost, which is really nice. So there we go.
We've got a question from Kate that says, thank you all for a brilliant discussion. I was really interested in what you all had to say about the role of musicians in horror, and Steve's argument about musicians being associated with otherness in horror. Tom's mention of Alice Cooper made me think more, though, about the way in which he has had an endless dialogue with horror throughout his musical career. He's obviously appeared in cameos in films like Prince of Darkness and Freddy's Dead, performed songs on horror film soundtracks like Jason Lives, but his songs and stage show has also been inspired by horror throughout his career. what did the panel think about this? Outside of Lady Gaga and David Bowie, has there been much scholarship on this kind of music? Artists, Cooper, Rob Zombie, or consistently bridges horror and sort of various music genres throughout their career? I mean, to me, that springs to mind something like Slipknot as well. Like, I remember being young and catching one of their videos, and it was basically a kind of a riff on The Shining.
Spit it out. That's
Yes.
all. Spit it out.
Yeah.
So again, I guess there is that kind of interplay, isn't there, where a whole act is utilizing horror tropes and generics kind of intertextually within their act. But yeah, opens up to Steve. You were nodding.
No, this is not something on which I am capable of answering. I'm just nodding about, yes, we have musicians in horror. There we go. I know very little about Rob Zombie or anyone else associated with popular music. What is popular music? Sorry, I didn't say that honestly, but I do feel like, hello, I'm a musicologist.
well, Rob Zombie's an interesting one, isn't he? Because he's in some ways has been championed by subcultures, but also perhaps but when he's translated into being a filmmaker, that hasn't worked quite as well, and he's perhaps not, his films have not been well received because he doesn't have the filmic skills compared to his sort of music acts.
I mean, I think for me, I'll champion Rob Zombie and a lot of his work. I'm probably one of the few, well, not necessarily the few people. I think there's been a bit of a resurgence in terms of the appreciation for his Halloween sort of remake or different version of Halloween. I really like Michael Myers as this really intensely violent young kid. Although there is a problem in that his kind of upbringing kind of explains some of his behavior, which I know a lot of people had a problem with in that iteration of the story. But yeah, so I think in terms of the scholarship that's been written, I'm not aware of anything which exists maybe as a sustained study of musicians and their involvement within the horror genre. I mean, I think that's something that I would like to write at some point. I think would be quite good. Although I think aside from there's a few articles on Rob Zombie that I'm aware of. Definitely book chapters which talk about his early cinema. So I suppose A House of Thousand Corpses in Devil's Rejects is kind of. I always kind of see them as maybe extensions of not necessarily his stage shows, but his music and his persona, and some of his interviews when he's kind of almost romanticizing figures like Charles Manson and how charismatic they were when they were initially kind of giving those interviews, which I'm sure people have seen the memes of 1,000 times, and how that kind of feeds into the cult, not the cult as in cult cinema, but like the cultish or representations of murderous cults in his own cinema. So I think that's really interesting, and obviously a lot of his imagery, he's kind of got a kind of crucifix burnt on his head, and it's that kind of provocative imagery which I think is really interesting. When I was doing my MA years ago, it was when I was taught by the late Peter Hutchings, and we kind of had these discussions about Rob Zombie, and Peter was always adamant that the music video for Dracula was the best piece of video work or film that Rob Zombie had ever done. And I remember at the time trying to convince him of the merits of Halloween, and he was touring Newcastle with Marilyn Manson. I think it was they kind of had a dual headlining show. And I tried to get an interview, but they didn't let me in the backstage area, which is probably unsurprising, to be fair, but there we go. So it is an interesting kind of subject, I think. But in terms of sustained scholarship, I think that is yet to be written, I guess, as far as I'm aware. Anyway.
I mean, guess to that point as well. I'm sort of echoing your point there, Tom, that I'm not too sure what's been read, but it does been written. Sorry, but it does speak to the kind of work that people like Suzanne Scott's done on the fanboy as auteur. That quite often a number of these musicians, the way they sort of have they're kind of bilingual, that they'll speak the language of the fan, and then they'll speak the language of the media that they're operating in. But I guess the musician is kind of, in some ways, if they're trying to do that, maybe trilingual, that, you know, someone like Rob Zombie, that he's a fan, a musician, and a filmmaker, however loosely we might want to use that term. But certainly the idea that but that maybe that speaks to kind of the cult cachet of some of these filmmakers or musicians who are being involved, that they often present themselves as fans of the genre that they're operating in as well, to kind of give them license to take up that space. We've got a question from Simon. The talk of vinyl reminds me of the BBC's album of horror sound effects in the 1970s. I was wondering whether the panel had come across any work on Foley artists and the contribution of Foley to horror.
Yes.
I haven't. Yes, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm interested in the ideas of sound and noise in horror. A lot of it has really been in the last 10 years. Obviously, remembering that in many respects, the study of film music and film sound and television sound is still relatively new. And so you've got things like William Whittington's article, which is in Harry Benshoff's companion to the horror film, and Bill Whittington's done an article. I think it's actually on horror sound design, or is it? Yes, sound design. But there's a specific article by Bill Whittington on sound design in Harry Benshoff. There Isabella Van Elfren, who is very, very good value for money, and hopefully people have come across her because she's one of the musicologists who regularly publishes in non-musicological journals, and in horror studies, I think she's got something called Sonic Horror, which looks at sound design as well as music. So she's looking at the whole kind of package. And one thing which has really emerged in film music, film sound studies over the last 10 years is this idea of the integrated soundtrack, of the way that sound and music exist in the same space, which I've written about in relation to horror. But Daniela, and I can never remember, so Daniela Kolesic Wilson has written a book called Sound Design is the New Score. Which really explores the way that sound design has, in some respects, taken over from music. And it kind of seems to me she hasn't noticed that so many of her examples come from horror. So she's looking across the field of film, but a lot of her examples are related to horror. So yes, there is a growing literature there.
We've got a question from Reese. There are 2 excellent scored to death books, interviews with horror composers specifically, and highly recommended if you're a horror fan, but more general works on film music, such as the Score documentary, I really like that, tend to ignore the genre and its music, not to mention award ceremonies, etc. Yet this in contrast to a significant and vocal fan base. So I wonder if the panel could reflect a little on the snobbery, for want of a better word, and the challenges of engaging with material that is often by nature designed to be unpleasant or upsetting to listen to.
Well, we were kind of talking about this before we started a little bit with the Oscars. Horror is not the only genre to be ignored by awards. It's anything that isn't drama is ignored by awards. Oh, my colleague's just back. Sorry, ignore him. He doesn't matter. Hi, Sam. So if you look at the Oscars, the vast majority of Oscars for original scoring have been awarded to drama, with rom-com the next one down, or is it romance films? And then you've got things like war films, westerns, sci-fi, horror, thriller, crime drama, family films, almost never, getting kind of 2 or 4 Oscars ever since they started in each of those genres. Biopic has never got an Oscar. That is the most not respected film. There we go. But so I think there is a problem with genre. I think anything which isn't drama, anything which sits in a genre category, as opposed to of course, drama isn't a genre. But it doesn't have the same kind of stylistic conventions which bound it in quite the same way. We think of it as more open, even if probably it's not. but never mind. So yeah, there is a problem with genre that horror is subject to, but it isn't just horror. I would say horror has probably had more written about it in film music studies than any other genre, by quite a long way. It really kicked off in 2009 when the first two edited collections on film music came out, and they were both on horror, and I was in both of them. And you know, horror film music studies had really kind of focused on monographs up to that point. And when finally we started getting edited collections, there was this almost inexplicable focus on horror, but it's not inexplicable. It's because horror music is just so interesting, and just so overt in the way that it constructs the idea of otherness and the uncanny and the abject and all the nasty things in life. And it is so inventive as a result, and embraced, for example, modernist music way before that made any inroads into the rest of film. So the music of horror has always been much more adventurous and challenging, and maybe that is why it's ignored. But horror's only had 2 Oscar wins, Jaws and The Omen, in consecutive years. Amazing, 75 and 76. And it's just had its next Oscar, 2023. Was its most recent Oscar nomination. Horror hasn't had an Oscar nomination for 30 years. The one before that was Interview with the Vampire. So yeah, it, along with a lot of other genre-based films, horror is ignored, but it's not ignored on its own. Everybody gets ignored unless it's drama.
I mean, I suppose the other side of that is that, and it speaks to maybe the sort of the niche and cult sensibilities we've been sort of discussing, is that a lot of fans, a lot of stuff kind of maybe champion the fact that it is not liked by everyone. And but then I suppose there are perhaps some people that kind of straddle this. David Lynch kind of comes to mind with the kind of music that he creates that's seen as perhaps art house, but also inaccessible in many different ways. But more to sort of, you know, Tom's collection of vinyl. You know, these are.
I think one of the other examples that you just made me think of there. So I've been doing fairly recently a lot of work on Nicholas Winding Refn, and I wrote a paper a few years ago. I didn't do anything with it, on the Neon Demon, and he's quite an interesting filmmaker in terms of straddling kind of horror in some respects, but kind of ultra violent content, representationally ultra violence, you know. And he works with well, in recent years, Cliff Martinez, who's got these really sort of weird, almost ethereal kind of soundscapes, which Refn uses alongside the kind of popular music, which always reminds me of the work of David Lynch, and especially his collaborations with Andrew Badalamenti and Twin Peaks and things like that. But again, you know, the fans of those filmmakers, they are really celebratory of those kind of connections. And I guess that idea that you've got these boutique labels recognizing the work of composers and kind of putting them out in these really lavish, expensive, you know, as I've kind of commented, editions of their work. I think again it's kind of a different form of celebration, I guess. And the labels that specialize in that kind of content are really kind of, you know, they get behind that kind of championing as well, you know. So yeah, that's kind of fun. Again, my record collection, just have to kind of have a look and sense that. Yeah.
I mean, Leanne, have you got anything? How you feel about this kind of snobbery? Either for, I mean, it goes back to some of the stuff that we've talked about around pop music in horror as well, isn't it? That you're kind of you're not the high end because you're either niche or you're popular, so you can't, you know, you're damned either way.
I think, you know, both Tom and Steve said some really important things about how value gets attached to certain types, genre of films or media, and then genres of music also. But I think there's also a space for when something's kind of critically derided or culturally derided, for you to champion it more and be more kind of vociferous in your praise of it, so it just makes you like it more. Which I think is an interesting consequence of this kind of treatment, this kind of maligning and kind of annexing of certain genres of music as well. And to go to the other bit of Reese's question, sometimes when I've written on things that are kind of full on horror, like I wrote a paper on Texas Chainsaw Massacre and then Wizard of Oz once, which necessitated watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre many, many times. So I ended up muting it. So that's part of the answer to your question, Reese, but it also made me think of I know there's been in the chat there about Misha Levi's work, and I remember the first time I saw Pablo Larraín's Jackie, which isn't horror, of course, but the events in it can be interpreted as horrific. And still, when I hear those keys out of context, just when they're on people's kind of curated best scores list or whatever, it still brings the same feeling as when I watched it in the cinema, which is terror. To put it mildly, it makes me kind of, it gave me a really kind of visceral, embodied reaction to it. It makes me feel a bit nauseous when I hear it.
But, I
There's
mean,
interesting
the power of that kind of sound, isn't it? We've got time for, well, we've got one question from Joanna. She said, thank you so much all. This has been fascinating. Interesting what you were saying, Steve, about lack of access to film scores. I've been endlessly searching for Levy's score of Blazes Under the Skin, which I love. I wondered if you had any pointers.
Yes. And it depends. Well, there are likely two routes, and it will depend on who actually owns the score. Sometimes the composer does not own the copyright to the score. It belongs to the studio. This is more independent. It's quite possible that she retained the copyright to her score. So one thing would be to approach her directly. I'm sure she has a website. She definitely has an agent. So track down the agent or the website, find a ways of getting in touch and saying, is it possible to see a copy of the score? I can't guarantee actually even what condition the score exists in. This was orchestral. There were a lot of strings in Under the Skin, weren't there? So there will have been some kind of instrumental score. Some films that there isn't a score. If a lot of it has been done electronically on synthesizers, there just ain't no score, even though you might think you're hearing instruments. So it'll be a kind of one person and their computer and their library of sounds. But I think this one was done live, and so there will be a score somewhere. It won't have been published in any form. It will just be, at best, you'll get photocopies of handwritten sheets. That's what I have with that Batman. I have 720 pages of photocopies of handwritten sheets that are about the size of a coffee table. They're absolutely gigantic. But yeah, I would say go to the composer first, approach directly, say, any chance, matey? And if she doesn't own it, it might have been put into some kind of library somewhere. Again, this is independent. You know, with the US, you just go to there is an archive at the University of California, and I went direct to Warner Brothers and to the Warner Brothers library, where they keep all their scores. So it will depend what it is, but with this one, I would say, I mean, this is what I did with Ben Salisbury. I just tracked him down on the internet and said, hi, can we talk about Archive 81, please? And he said yes. And same with David Buckley, with The Good Wife, of all things, the range of what I do. But I was talking to David Buckley about The Good Wife, and sometimes, particularly if they're British composers, American composers just won't talk to me, but British ones will. And Michael Levy, I think, is British. So track her down, talk to her.
We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask, we did mention it before this was recorded, but favourite horror soundtracks? Right, we're going to go Leanne first.
I'm giving a very classic but beloved answer, which is John Carpenter's score for Halloween, because I watched it every Halloween with my dad since I was about 14.
But it speaks to the sort of autobiographical thing of, you know, these evoke memories.
Yeah.
And Tom?
So my choice was Return of the Living Dead, which is obviously a mixture of kind of classic punk, like the Damned, kind of I suppose 1980s hardcore, adjacent bands like T-Sol, and also one of my favourite kind of more contemporary hardcore bands, More Paramedics, takes their name from a line spoken in that film. So I'm going to go with Return of the Living Dead. I think it's my choice. Yeah.
And Steve?
It's Interview with the Vampire, the film that got me interested in film music in general in the first place back in January 1995. The 11th of January 1995, in fact. That's when my film music career began.
And I'm going to say Annihilation, just because it is, yeah, it's can't put it into words. So yeah, a big round of applause for our guest speakers. This has been so much fun and so fascinating to hear you all talk. So thank you so much, and thank you for the audience and for all the awesome questions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you for such a fascinating discussion. It was really, really great. Shelley and I will we'll put out information about our next event, which is on the, I know we said when it was, and then
26th of June.
I've forgotten, 26th of June, which will be on teaching silent horror cinema. So kind of related, actually, follows on nicely. It's like a prequel. So thanks very much, everybody. Thank you to James for organising an excellent sharing. And thank you to Steve, Tom and Leanne for a great discussion. And we'll hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.